Now I call upon our second distinguished speaker, Honorable Tom Andrews. Honorable Tom Andrews is the President and the Chief Executive Officer of the United to End Genocide, based in Washington, D.C., in the United States. Honorable Tom Andrews is a former congressman from the state of Maine, and he has most recently served as the National Director of Win Without War, a coalition of the 40 national organizations promoting a more progressive national security strategy that calls for prudent use of military engagement. He has worked to promote democracy and human rights throughout the world. Honorable Tom Andrews is a strong advocate of Rohingya people. He has fought for Rohingya in the Capitol Hill, testified with me many times in the Congress hearings, and he was actively engaged in Resolution 418 and pursuing right now for more resolutions from U.S. Senate, as well as more resolution from U.S. House of Representatives. Honorable Tom Andrews has visited Arakan, visited many parts of Burma. He has personally witnessed how these people are suffering. And I call upon Honorable Tom Andrews to provide his perspective and his experience and his views and visions about Rohingya policy. Please welcome Honorable Tom Andrews.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dean, and thank you very much, everyone. I brought my watch with me because, as I told the group in the last ISNA conference that I had the honor to participate in, I confessed that I was a recovering politician. Since the last ISNA conference in which I spoke, I wish I could come today and tell you that conditions have improved, but as you've heard so pointedly and powerfully today, and as we've seen in the news over the last year, things have deteriorated. They've gotten even worse. And as we've heard, the rights of the Rohingya have been systematically abolished, denied, and campaigns of hatred and bigotry, systematic campaigns, well-financed campaigns, stirring up fear and hatred among the people of Burma about Muslims, the Muslim community in general, and the Rohingya in particular. They've never been more powerful, well-financed, and sophisticated. There are elements of hope, and the hope resides in our minds, in our hearts, and in compassion, a fundamental ingredient of the values of Islam. And we've been able to see those three combined with action. Last year I asked everyone who was participating to please support H.R. 418, a resolution before the House of Representatives that brought this crisis directly to the floor of the House and called upon not only the government of Myanmar to change its policies and reverse direction from the systematic persecution, but called on the government of the United States to take a stronger stand on behalf of the Rohingya. It passed overwhelmingly. And one of the most powerful moments of that debate was the fact that they took, since I've been here last, I've been up into the camps visiting Rohingya 3 times, 3 different trips. And I took photographs of what I saw because it would be unbelievable, I thought, to just simply try to describe what I was seeing. So I took these photographs and I brought them to the halls of Congress. And leaders of both the Democratic and Republican Party said, when we go to the floor to talk about the Rohingya, we want your photographs on the floor with us, showing the Rohingya people. We want to tell the stories of the suffering that is going on in that part of the world. And so the head and the heart, the compassion, was appealed to of members of Congress and the American public. And just as we saw in the horrible tragedy going on in Syria and in Europe just 2 days ago, that photograph of a 3-year-old Syrian that was on a beach, face down, drowned, trying to save himself and his father trying to save his family, has turned around the intransigence of so many governments to not accept and not support those who are seeking salvation. The head and the heart, very, very powerful. I went into the camps, as I mentioned 3 times. One of my trips, I brought a group of ASEAN parliamentarians from Indonesia and from Malaysia and from Cambodia and nations around ASEAN. And I said, I want you to see for yourself what it is we're talking about. Because ASEAN, in addition to the United States, is in a position of incredible influence on the government of Myanmar, and you must act in ways that you haven't acted before. So we went, we issued a report which I have brought today, and this report was put before the ASEAN Summit of Prime Ministers in Kuala Lumpur in the spring, and was delivered to each Prime Minister that was attending that summit. These parliamentarians had a news conference that was widely covered throughout the region. The New York Times, the Washington Post, it was covered in Burma. And for the first time, the ASEAN prime ministers decided that the principle of non-interference, which is such a core principle of the way ASEAN works, was no longer adequate. The foreign minister of Malaysia announced in a news conference opening up that summit, he said, ladies and gentlemen, the principle of non-interference is no longer adequate when we see the crisis of the Rohingya before our very eyes. Burma, of course, the government of Myanmar characteristically responded by denial. They said that there are no Rohingya on those boats, and they're certainly not from our country. Of course, the president of Myanmar says there are no Rohingya in my country, continues to publicly say this. And then the other governments in the ASEAN countries that were on that, surrounding those poor, desperate people, instead of mounting a major search and rescue operation, deploying navies to rescue these families, they deployed their navies to tie the boats up and pull them farther out to sea, so they wouldn't have responsibility for those desperate asylum seekers and refugees. This, ladies and gentlemen, is outrageous and unacceptable, and should be unacceptable to every human being on this planet. What an outrage! But the world saw it. The world saw it. And from that recognition, the heads, the hearts of some were raised, and finally there was some action. Now, as I said, there is a long, long way to go. There are elements of hope, but the challenge is immense. H.R. 418 passed in the House of Representatives, but those of you who are from this country and helped us to pass 418, we need you to help us to pass a similar similar resolution in the United States Senate that is now being developed. Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey is spearheading that effort. We need to generate support. The Senate has to hear from us, number one. Number two, I was so pleased when the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who leads the Senate, and has been a strong advocate of Aung San Suu Kyi and the reforms and the positive steps that were taken when Aung San Suu Kyi went from house arrest into Parliament. But he took to the floor a few months ago and he said that he was very disturbed by developments in Burma today. And he says that it's about time for the United States to start reconsidering its relationship with this country and start considering potential sources of economic pressure on that government. We need to support that kind of talk coming from the United States Senate. And President Obama. When President Obama lifted the economic pressure on the government of Burma that led to the reforms that were celebrated a few years ago, he said that he would retain the authority to put individual sanctions on individuals who are responsible for human rights violations. He would put people on a list called the Special Designated Nationals list that would provide penalties for them and their families, economic bite, in other words. And we have to tell President Obama that the pressure needs to start now to defend the people in that part of the world. out to tell you that we are in the midst right now of a very dangerous situation. The United Nations, UNHCR, issued a report just a few days ago that said that there is a grave danger of that boat crisis breaking out once again. With the combination of the continued deteriorating conditions in Rakhine State in Burma, in the camps, the combination of those deteriorating conditions, the blocking of aid going to so many desperate people, and the end of the rainy season, and therefore the possibility of human traffickers enticing more people out to sea is great. So we could be seeing, according to the United Nations, a new wave of refugees and asylum seekers in the dangerous waters once again. We also know that there is an election coming up, a national election in Myanmar in November. So we have a very important job to do. As Americans, as humans, it is time for us in this period of danger to speak truth to power, to rise up with our heads, our hearts, and our activism to change the course of history. In big ways and small. You know, when I had lunch after we had the session 1 year ago at ISNA, and I asked one of the distinguished speakers, I said, what would be the single most important thing for President Obama to do when he visits Burma in November, which is the last year? And he looked at me and he said, if he just said the name Rohingya when he was in Burma, because the government is putting all kinds of pressure on governments that do business with Burma to not say the name, and so no one's saying their name. They said even Secretary Kerry never mentioned their name when he went to Burma last. It would be so powerful, he said, if the president would just say their name. So when we spoke to the administration, we talked to key officials in the State Department, they said, oh, well, what's in a name? What's in a name? And so we started a campaign in which an Instagram campaign. I gave this speech to some kids up in Maine, and they said, "That's terrible. We're going to start an Instagram campaign." And everyone was holding a sign, and it said, "Mr. President, just say their name. Just say their name." And this went from Falmouth High School to all over the world, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, until finally, at the end of this trip, an Associated Press reporter said, "There's something going on all over the internet that wants you to say the name Rohingya. Mr. President, will you say the name?" And he said the name, and he said, we need to stop the attacks that are going on against this community. So in big ways and in small ways, let us recognize the horror, but let's also recognize the hope. And with our heads and our hearts and our action, let's save the Rohingya. Thank you.
We're doing okay with time. Before I call upon our next distinguished speaker, I do want to thank Lord Nazir Ahmed for coming here, because Lord Nazir will have to catch a flight, and then Lord Nazir will be leaving in a few minutes. So let's please thank Lord Nazir.